Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Thanks, Mark. In search, didn't I open it? I thought I did. In search of the oldest house in London. Let's find out.
London is an ancient city that has changed a lot over the centuries. Between fire, invasions, wars, and the simple march of progress, it's been knocked about. A lot. Yet every so often you'll find some curious surviving building that made it through everything to the present day. Today, we are going in search of the oldest house in London. Now, I'm not going to count things like palaces and castles.
I love how the oldest house in the U.S., which is probably somewhere in like Philadelphia or Boston, or would not even be considered an old house.
Because, to be honest, I don't find them as interesting as small private residences. Our first house is numbers 41 to 42 Cloth Fair, just off Smithfield. This is one of the oldest parts of the city, so it's not entirely surprising that we should find some very old buildings here. Smithfield is a very bloody place indeed. It was the site of many executions, and we find memorials to such martyrs as Wat Tyler and William Wallace nearby. It was also a site of slaughter of animals, which is why there is a meat market there today. There have been plans to move this out for a while, but I actually really like the fact that there's this 1,000-year line of history here, and I will be very sad when it finally moves out. Also, there's cheap wholesale meat if you're willing to get up early in the morning. What was I talking about?
Old houses.
41 to 42 Cloth Fair. This is believed to have been built between 1597 and 1614 as a merchant's house. Hence the fact that it's quite grand by the standards of 17th century houses. It was part of a development known as Launders Square. By the 1700s, it was being used as a shop.
It is kind of crazy because if I had to guess, I would have said 1800s at the earliest.
First by a draper, then in the 19th century by a tobacconist. It's had a few lucky escapes. It managed to avoid the Great Fire by being shielded by the walls of the Priory of St. Bartholomew. In 1929, the Corporation of the City of London wanted to knock it down, considering it to be a safety hazard. It was saved when architects John Seeley and Paul Paget bought it, restored it, and turned it into an architect's office. During the Second World War, this area was heavily bombed. Most of the neighbouring Aldersgate was levelled. But this little house was missed. In 1995, it was further restored, and in 2000, it won a City Heritage Award. And it's once again a house. Number 41 has had many illustrious visitors over the years, including William Blake, John Wesley, Winston Churchill, the Queen Mother, and General Montgomery. Apparently Sir John Betjeman visited a number of times, which is not entirely surprising given his well-known interest in historic buildings, and the fact that he lived basically next door. Literally just around the corner is the gatehouse of St. Bartholomew the Great. This church turns 900 in 2023, having been founded as an Augustinian priory. Apparently St. Bartholomew's was founded by one Raher, who may have been a herald, a courtier, a monk, a minstrel, or even a jester in the court of King Henry I. He had a vision that a winged beast appeared.
I thought minstrels and jesters were the same. No?
To him and told him to found a church in first. He had a vision that a winged beast appeared to him and told him to found a church in Smithfield. He had difficulty getting this built as the land was royal property, but the king granted it when Raher explained his divine vision, which is one way around the planning regulations. The church has been rebuilt over the centuries, as you might expect.
Sorry, it looks like a Slytherin logo, but with like the Ulster red hand on it.
The church has been rebuilt over the centuries, as you might expect. The priory included a hospital, which of course survives to this day, but now as part of the NHS. But the gatehouse is what we're here for. In 1536, St. Bart's fell victim to the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, and many of the buildings were destroyed. Oh, Henry VIII, why couldn't you be more like Henry I? The church and its lands were bought out thereafter by a gentleman named Richard Rich, 1st Baron Rich, who presumably had a fair bit of money. In
Richard Rich.
1595, a gentleman named William Scudamore bought the remains of the southern doorway and built a house on top of it. Legend has it that Queen Mary I dined here while the Protestant martyrs were burned, which would have been pretty impressive given that she'd been dead for 37 years when the house was built. The gatehouse, like the houses on Clothfair, was saved from the Great Fire by the priory walls. In the 18th century, the Tudor detailing was hidden by a brickwork facade, which meant that its age and significance were missed by most people. In 1917, the old structure was accidentally revealed when a Zeppelin bombed the area and partially demolished the facade.
Wow.
In 1932, the house was restored to its former glory. From 1948 to 1979, the house was used as a school, but not a very big one. It's now an interesting mix of features, from the Tudor-style timber-framed buildings to the medieval stonework at the base. It's no longer a house, so I must admit that I'm slightly pushing the definition of oldest house in London. But there was no way I was going to come to Smithfield and talk about ancient houses and not include this.
Such a classic-looking building that just makes it feel old, and I wonder what the... Clearly, it was just a really good way in the time of building a house, having a wooden structure, and then I'd imagine they filled it in with some... If anyone knows what the white part is, some kind of medieval plaster.
Having pushed the definition of oldest house, I'm now going to push the definition of in London. We're off to Walthamstow.
Look how clean it is.
For most of
New
its
York,
existence,
come on.
Walthamstow had been a separate town from the city. But the 19th and 20th centuries brought a lot of development to the area, and in 1965 it formally became part of Greater London. In other words, when the house we're going to look at was built, Walthamstow was not London, but now it is. This is the ancient house, believed to have been built in 1435, making it over 160 years older than our previous contenders. As compared to the other two, relatively little is known about the house's history. It was built as a hall house, where everything comes off a central hall. Naturally, it was rebuilt in various ways over the years, and mostly it just seems to have sat there. Just, you know, being a house. Although at some point it was a bicycle shop. It was only in the 1930s that its significance was realized. By this time, the original structure was hidden behind weatherboarding. In 1934, it was restored and rebuilt to as close to the original as possible. Many of the features you see today are actually replicas, but it is still a private residence. Features you see was restored and rebuilt to as close to the original as possible. Many of the features you see today are actually replicas, but it is still a private residence.
So you're telling me, before America even existed, before people even landed in North America around the same time, this building was still here, although he did say it was changed a bit, right? But you guys are so lucky, and just please recognize it. A lot of you guys do in the comments I see, but it's something. I love America, okay? I don't want to make it be like, oh God, I wish I lived somewhere else. I don't feel that way. I'm happy with New England, but if there's one thing that just makes me incredibly jealous is knowing that you guys have 4 times the amount of length of history and layers on layers on layers of history and older stuff. It's so awesome.
Features you see today are actually replicas, but it is still a private residence. So I think, provisos about London aside, we have here the oldest house in London. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do hit the like button and consider subscribing for more.
Sure.
There are a lot of buildings I could have mentioned but didn't. There are a couple of other contenders in Greater London that beat out the city buildings. And there are some other interesting survivors of the Great Fire that aren't houses. I guess what I'm saying is, let me know in the comments if you'd like more on really old buildings in London that survive. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the protective facade to my Tudor structure. And I'll see you all again very soon.
I would like to see where the oldest buildings in London are that there are record of. So not just the ones that got destroyed over time or in fires or in bombing raids or whatnot, but if everything did survive, I wonder what the oldest. I'd imagine 1100, 1200. I'm not sure. Hope you guys are all doing well. I'd appreciate any comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.